Okay, so want to continue with the concept of shape-shifting by telling a little bit about my story and some of the things I've come across about how I found the spirit that would teach me, and who that spirit was. I didn't start out trying to learn how to shapeshift. That was not even remotely on my mind. When I started learning the art, I didn't even know that shapeshifting was one of the things you can do with it. That would not be, that'd be 30 years later that I made, connected 2 plus 2 and said, oh my goodness, this is 4, that the shape shifting phenomena is the same phenomena that had been getting taught, the same altered state. It was just a different application of the same altered state that does all this other stuff, this basic rudimentary shamanic art stuff. So there is all kinds of stuff you can do with this. If you are heart set on working towards transforming into an animal, that is a thing you can work towards. Um, but there's all kinds of other stuff you can do too. So that I want to kind of tell the story. I want to tell the story about how I really came to understand this. Have discussions with the spirits about this as an art, and what they told me and what they encouraged me to do, because this all plays into suggestions I might make in future videos, and it gives a foundation of where I'm coming from and why I'm making the suggestions I might make. What worked well, what unfortunately did not work very well, and how I might change it if I had the choice to. So I've told a lot of little stories about some of my beginnings. I've talked about how I've had multiple near death experiences. I've talked about how shortly after my first near death experience, I became a stolen child. And if you haven't seen my video on stolen children, this is a thing that does occur. It still occurs even to this day. It still occurs even in North America. I've heard recently of several stolen children from Canada and from the U.S. There was one just the other year that there was a kid down in, I think it was Georgia, who got taken. Uh, Generally not something we discuss as a culture. It's something we don't really talk about, but it does happen. And there's the two different ways of going about doing it. You're taken into the other world and you come back, or you're taken and you do not come back. Either is technically classified as a stolen child experience. For me, I was taken repeatedly, and I was always brought back. And no, it has nothing to do with aliens. Um, at least not to my knowledge. So I had this interaction with the spirits when I was young. Did not ask for it, did not seek it. It just, for whatever reason. And in that interaction, I mean, the very first thing they told me was that, the question of, why me is not an unusual question. And I certainly asked it. And they had told me, look, you will one day have an opportunity to make a choice. And that choice you make is directly going to affect the well being of our lives, spirit people. At least that tribe of spirit people, who knows what more. And we want to make sure that you are the kind of person we can trust to make the right choice. They didn't mention what the choice would be, they didn't mention what the right choice would be. But they just said that if I was not the right person to make the right choice, that they weren't going to allow me to grow up. So, that's a nice way to start a relationship. But I started to have, frequent interaction with the spirits along these lines. Eventually, they did start to teach me. And I was found to be not repugnant, which is a mixed blessing. Um, they didn't really start teaching me shapeshifting right away. I'm 3 years old. The primary things they were teaching me, and it kind of makes sense based on what they told me, was that they were teaching me the idea of the kind of the great web of life, the idea that humans and spirits and the world of nature were intermeshed and interlocked and dependent upon each other, and the choices we made affected each other. And obviously that was their concern right from the beginning, that I was a person who would one day make a choice, and they wanted to make sure that I would not do harm to presumably the natural world and certainly the spirit world. And so they'd spend a lot of time teaching me that, hey, this relationship is really important, and so on. And that's not unusual nowadays. We've heard that various traditional cultures have that perspective, that sort of animistic perspective, the idea that humans are not on the top or in the center and all the world revolves around us, but that we're just one of many within a network of beings, which is you know the version of reality I choose to adhere to, or I prefer to adhere to. Um, they did teach me other things. They taught me about spirits. They taught me about how the spirit world was organized, and they explained to me some of the different creatures that live in the spirit world and how they live and so forth and so on. They kind of gave me a crash course introduction to the other reality. But you know, nothing, no good thing goes unpunished, and people did become aware that something weird was going on with me. It led to a whole thing with psychiatrists. So if you hear me really dissing psychiatrists, well, they fired the first shot. And yeah, yeah. I generally I understand that not all of them are bad people, but I also understand that the discipline carries with it a certain amount of psychosis. I mean, there's kind of a reason why. What job creates the most psychosis and the second most suicides? Psychologists. There's a certain amount of psychosis that goes with it. I didn't know that then. I had a long way to go and a lot to learn before I realized that. But these are not necessarily stable people, and they certainly did not know how to deal with somebody who was having spiritual interactions. Because of course you don't have such things. Such things don't exist. You must be nuts. And their reaction was, you need to be locked away. You need to be, under constant supervision. You need to be locked away. So, in and out of it, long story short, I ended up losing my connection with the spirits, which was really a very sore blow. I've talked to many traditional, actual shamans from Asia, or several anyways, since then, and they said, yeah, you kind of blew it. So I kind of blew it. The whole idea that those people who go through that, and there's people in many places in Asia that report exactly that phenomena to this day. A child is taken by the spirits teach them, and provided they stay in the same place, and I did not, I moved away quite a long ways, and provided they maintain this relationship with the spirits, they tend to be pretty good at this stuff. And of course, I lost my connection with the spirits, and then of course I moved away from the place. So being spirits of place, I to some degree I lost a lot. I lost a lot in that. Um, at the same time, there was a certain, there was a certain relief to it. Like I said, I think I've said it, I don't know, maybe it's two goes, I said about, spirituality is a path that is a fearful, if you're not afraid a little bit, you're not learning, because you should be confronting the strange and the new and the unusual. I mean, obviously there's nasty stuff that you don't want to deal with. There's creepy stuff that can be overwhelming. There's stuff that's bad and can go bad. But even if it's good stuff, it should be really challenging. It should be forcing you to self-reflect. It should be forcing you to ask very deep questions of yourself and try to figure out, where things aren't working. So it is very self-reflective. It is very challenging. You're constantly being presented by stuff that is just plain strange, and you've got to deal with it, and that invokes a certain level of fear. And there's no question that just sitting in a room talking to a luminous shape-shifting orb invokes a certain level of fear. And so when they did leave, there was a certain, at least initially, a feeling of relief. But they brought something into my world that I could not quite easily comprehend. I mean, one of the major subjects of fear for me was the fact that nobody knew what this was. I was living in a culture where this was not a thing. It didn't exist. and nobody talked about it. Nobody knew about it. I really wanted to have somebody to talk to that I could just say, "Oh yeah, that thing. Don't worry about it. Just keep going with it, kid." And there was nobody. So, complete isolation on this. And of course, didn't dare to speak about it too much because, people betray you and people decide that you need to be locked away. So you learn to keep your yap shut, but then you don't get your questions answered. So this really created concern for me because even with the spirits gone, even without going into the other world anymore, I really wanted to know what the hell was that. And I surreptitiously and learned cautiously try to probe people about did they know anything about this. And of course, nobody knew. The church, the people at church just got mad. They didn't want to talk about that stuff at all. That was freaky stuff. That was over the top. And they knew nothing. They knew nothing spiritually at all. It was complete ignorance on their part about anything about the spiritual world. They didn't even know that sort of stuff could happen. And it scared them far worse than it ever scared me. And of course, he didn't dare talk to teachers or anything. Those were the people who kind of turned on me in the first place. I know they thought they were doing right by me, but you know, mm. but and really nobody knew about it. And I mean, of course, I'm about 5 years old, 6 years old when this all comes to a conclusion. And there's a lot about the world I didn't understand. I didn't have an understanding of why our world was the way it was and everything, nor did I yet know how to obtain that knowledge. So it was all a great big mystery. Pardon me. So, anyways, I spent a lot of times trying to still figure out what the hell was going on, and I can't say that I made much headway. In that time, of course, I started to manifest other capacities that are not atypical of a person like myself, in so much as, intuitively knowing things I had no business knowing and having visions of the future that came to pass. And of course, this concerned me also greatly, especially since the first real whammy of a vision was watching somebody repeatedly be hit by a car and killed, and it culminated in a very good friend of mine being hit by a car and killed. And so, the double whammy of coming to face with mortality in that kind of direct way for the first time. But also then saying, well, why for 4 weeks before my friend died did I have to watch it happen over and over and over again, and why was I able to do nothing about it? And this was, grief and trauma. And, how do you overcome that? And how do you want to talk to somebody. There's nobody to talk to. So eventually there was a thing. My family took a vacation to the Wisconsin Dells when I was probably about 7 years old. And one of the things that transpired there was we went to the Native American dance thing that used to go on. I don't think it goes on anymore. But there was the local Ho-Chunk people put on a display of their traditional dances at an amphitheater up on a lake there and so on. And my family was keen to go to this, and so we're out on a boat late at night, and there was a couple of the native people who were on the boat. It was just kind of there for the sake of the tourists, whatever. And I was just sitting there, and I was kind of looking out over the dark water as the boat made its way up to the amphitheater. And a native man came and he sat down next to me. And, shy. I was interested, but I didn't even begin to know. I mean, again, introvert. So extreme introvert. I don't do well with, small talk. And so it's a stranger. I feel a little consternation, the fact that a stranger just sat beside me. And I didn't know what to say. It was late at night. It was late night for me. It was past my bedtime, so I was tired, and I didn't really feel very social. And so my curiosity did not necessarily win out. And so I just kind of turned my head, and I was looking out the window and stuff like that. And he didn't say hi. He didn't introduce himself or anything like that. Just a few moments passed, and then he started to talk to me, and he said, you you've got a long, he just started right out. He's like, you've got a long road ahead of you. Our people know about people like you. We're aware that people like you exist, and you've got a long and difficult road ahead of you. Normally, we would help you. We've sworn oaths that we would help people like you. But right now, our people can't even help themselves. Plus, your government, which totally beyond my understanding as a 7-year-old, would not appreciate a white child living on our reservation. And he's just hitting me with all this stuff. You know, as a 7-year-old, my takeaway was, holy crap, he knows what's been happening to me. I didn't say a word. It's not like I was wearing a badge on my sleeve saying weirdo. He just knew. You know, I don't know how he knew, but he just knew. He knew without a doubt what had been going on in my life. And for the first time, I understood that there was somebody who got it. And, you know, unfortunately was then saying, and you're on your own, kid. You know, like to help you, can't help you. And I understand. I mean, it would take me many, many decades to understand that during that time period was the period of AIM, the American Indian Movement, and there was pretty much out and out war between the government and the Native Americans, and the government was actually assassinating Native Americans, especially medicine men and stuff, and that there was a real, you know, real bad things going on at that time. Even more so than today, I gather. But you know, yeah, there's no question that if I had gone up to be with any native tribe during that time period, there would have been hell to pay. There would have been people would have been arrested, possibly murdered. So, you know, he had a point. As much as, you know, it was disappointing to not have that, you know, explained. You know, what is a person like me? I mean, I still don't know to this day who is a person like me. You know, why have they, you know, made oaths to help people like me? What help me how? You know, so forth and so on. And I mean, this is not the only time this has happened in my life. I've had other Hyoka and medicine men say the exact same thing, or damn near the exact same thing at various intervals during my life. But they all come back around to, and we can't help you. But, you know, it made me really, number one, realize it was a thing, it was real, that at least somebody out there understood that it was normal, or at least to them it was normal, and that it was potentially an important thing and a good thing. And it made me really kind of regret losing contact with the spirits. And it made me think that, well, maybe it wasn't a bad thing after all. Maybe I'd made a horrible mistake in losing what chance had put in my path or whatever. And so shortly after that, I mean, I thought about it for a good long time. And I started to put out feelers to see if the spirits would come back. And they never did. They never did. Or those original spirits never returned. But after a time, there was a voice that started to show up in my head. And it wasn't an auditory voice. It was like a thought in my head. And for a long time, I would feel funny, which is to say I was in an altered state. I didn't necessarily recognize it at that time. I would feel funny, and there would be a very clear thought in my head that would say this, that, or the other thing. And I started to realize that there was a pattern here, and when I felt thusly, and when this thought that sounded different than my normal thoughts kind of came on, that something was up, because the things that were being said and the information that was being imparted was information that my other children of my age had no clue about, wouldn't have understood, wouldn't have even worried, cared about. They wouldn't have even known to ask the questions. They certainly didn't know it. And here I'm starting to know things that, you know, are well in advance of other kids my age. And this voice is telling me these things. And so I began to suspect that maybe this had something to do with the spirits again. And so, really kind of more and more wanting this to develop, I didn't ask too many questions, which is not a good policy, but I didn't know better at the time. So I just kind of like, well, we'll see where this goes. We'll see who this is. Because I was hoping it was the original spirits. It wasn't. But the interesting thing, and this is where shapeshifting starts to come in, is that that voice that started to come back started to ask me to do things. It started to make suggestions. And it started to say, what would happen if you played, or if you pretended this, that, or the other thing. So, and it started to encourage me. I mean, it would come and go. There'd be like months it didn't show up, and then all of a sudden it would show up, and it would be saying, it was like there was one time there was a dime, and I found a dime on the playground, and the voice was encouraging me to play a game with the dime of throwing it up in the air and having it stay in the air. And I did it a bunch of times, and nothing really happened. It came back down the way you'd normally expect it to come back down. But I kept kind of getting into this game. I kept playing it despite the fact that nothing was happening. And then one time when I threw it up, it hung in the air for maybe about half a second too long. And as soon as it didn't come back down immediately after its normal arc of its throw, as I threw it up and it went up and it just hesitated. And I went, whoa! And immediately it came back down again. And that was the last time I threw it because that was kind of freaky and I wasn't sure really what to think about it. I wasn't entirely sure the spirits were back. I wasn't entirely sure what I just seen. I wasn't entirely sure that that was real. And, so here comes the fear and discomfiture again that something's something unnatural has just happened here. And actually, I never played that game again. Almost tempted to take a dime out of my pocket like right now and just see what I could do. But this was a beginning because, as I said in the last video, shape shifting is approached through games. Getting into the right mindset is approached through games. And so this was one of the games that was introduced to me of just thinking about imagining that the coin would stay up in the air and throwing it up in the air. And at some point, it did in fact stay up in the air just a little too long, which ends up becoming an interesting thing because that comes back, and I don't know if we'll get into it in this video, but I want to talk about Red Elk, the Shoshone Hyoka, inner Hyoka, and he talks about doing the same thing with yourself. Actually you jumping up in the air and hanging up in the air a little too long. And we'll get into that. If they're not in this video, we will get into that. There's a lot that Red Elk had to say that I really want to bring back out. And I don't think many people remember or know Red Elk anyway, so I want to bring that stuff out and kind of put my 2 cents in. So after the going thing, soon the voice started to say things about the weather. And they said it was starting to postulate things. Well, what if you thought like this? What would happen, do you think? And it culminated in a situation where, again, going into it kind of feeling odd, kind of getting me into this odd feeling state, I would look at the weather and I would say something. And over the next, period of time, a couple hours, that's exactly what the weather would do. Now, this also freaked me out again, but, by this time I'm probably 9 years old, and I realized it's like, that's got to be coincidence. It's got to be coincidence. So I did poke at that one a few more times. I started working on that one a few more times again. And every time I did it, is exactly what I said would happen. And that really freaked me out, because again, it's like, I suppose I'm weird when it comes to the whole issue of spiritual stuff because I've been very reluctant through all of this. I've been determined, it is the direction I want to go in. It is the thing I am dedicated to, but at the same time, it makes me deeply nervous because it's just so weird. As much as I could never turn away from it, it's just so weird. And so I kind of backed away from that for a while. It transpired that my family was going to move away. And actually, the interesting thing there was that the voice, it was while we were in the process of moving, that the voice started to come in very strongly and introduce itself, not by name, but saying, what are you going to do when you get to where you're going, and may I suggest this, and if you want to talk, you can come talk to me, and so on. And so there's this, voice in my head. Didn't see anything, didn't get taken into any other world. I would not be taken into any other world again for many years, but eventually I would be, and have been many times since, but not like I was when I was a little kid. But but here I am. I'm going to teach you some stuff. So we get to the new place, and it took a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden the voice starts popping up, and the voice starts saying, hey, and this is where real training began, because it started to teach me how to journey into the world, so how I could build a contact with the spirit so that we could interact more easily, how I could go into altered states of consciousness, how I could do basic shamanic journeying and stuff like that. So didn't mention the word shaman, but the spirit taught me all this stuff. And then amongst it comes back to again, what if you were to play the game that you could? And a lot of it's continued to focus on weather. I've always done extremely good weather work. Generally speaking, if you pursue this art, you'll probably find that you're really good at one thing. So some people are really good at using this art to bring fortune into their life, and they can magic in, amazing amounts of money and success. Some people can use it to find lost objects. Some people can heal themselves very effectively. Some people can heal other people very effectively. Some people work with animals very effectively. All the different, fairly typical magical shaman stuff, and you're probably going to find that you're really, really good at one of them. And you may have to really work with some of the other. But it all comes back to it's based in a game. And the teaching voice, which appeared to be female in nature, would keep saying, what if you were to pretend that you could, whatever it was? And dutiful friend, student, whatever the hell I was, I would say, okay, well, I'm going to give it a try. I'll do it. If I was asked to do something, I did it. And it kept forming this pattern, and it kept freaking me out. Eventually, I got to the point where I was like, okay, I've got to find out, is this real or is this not? I still understand I can't talk to anybody in my culture. I don't have access to the native people who seem to know about this, and they don't seem to want to talk to me anyway. So I can't go to people. It's not written in books. I've started looking through the books. It's not in the books. I know there's no adults. I can't talk to any teachers. I can't talk to my friends. I can't talk to anyone. Anytime I start to even begin to broach the subject, people start to, their eyebrows start to go up towards the sky, and their eyes get really big, and it's like, what are you talking about? And you could see that they're about to kind of like collapse in on themselves, and you say, oh, nothing, that's unimportant. And so I had to kind of postulate, how am I going to figure out whether this is real or not? Because maybe it's not real. I mean, again, I had kind of the combined thing is that the whole psychologist and teacher betrayal, there's a whole thing. You're nuts. And so I didn't think I was nuts, but I didn't know. Maybe I was nuts. Maybe I am nuts. How would I know? How could I tell? Especially at the age of 3, how would I know? And even later on at the age of 15, 14, 15, 16 years old, what did I know about nuts? I didn't feel that I was specifically nuts, but obviously these weird things were happening to me. I had not yet found out that this is really common all the rest of the way around the world. Somebody once gave me a bumper sticker, and I don't put bumper stickers on my vehicle, but they gave me a bumper sticker, and it says, I'm perfectly normal in other cultures. Or something along those lines is like, and that's so very true in my case, is that there are plenty of cultures around the world, traditional peoples, cultures, where I would be considered perhaps not normal, but they at least know what the hell was going on. And not in this one. So I'm extraordinarily weird in this culture. And so the question was, okay, there's nowhere I can go. There's nowhere I can look up the data. There's nowhere I can find any of this information. I'm going to have to devise a means for myself to figure out whether this is real or not. And the program that I decided to engage in was that I would play these games that the spirits had given me that caused changes in the weather. But I would specifically try to go big. Not just making a cloud, doing cloud bursting like a lot of people talk about, or calling a breeze or something like that, because that could easily be random chance. That was going to happen anyways, and all you were doing was just staring at the sky. You weren't actually having any effect. How would you know? And so I was like, well, in this time period, the Weather Channel was a thing. So, it's like, okay, I can watch the weather. The family watches the weather all the time. I can watch the weather. And the Spirit's been encouraging me to work with the weather and stuff like that. So what I'll do is I will play the game that I've been given to play, but I will specifically play the game for things that are just, I've never seen them before. I've never seen them happen. They just pretty much don't happen. And I'm going to shoot big. I'm going to shoot as big as I feel I can. I'm going to shoot as big as I dare. And see if things continue to happen. See if I'm self-deceiving or not. Because, if it's just chance, then it should not work most of the time. And especially on big events, it should not work a good chunk of the time, or it shouldn't come out quite like I anticipated. The odds of highly unlikely large events from happening at a rate of success would have to be considered highly substantial. And so I knew that this was a good way to prove to myself, one way or another, was there any validity in the games I was being taught to play, which was getting me in the same state of mind that I eventually would understand was shapeshifting. And so I did. I shot big. And so I started to play with, major rainstorms and the jet stream and hurricanes and stuff like that, and playing the game with the idea that they would take unusual courses, that they would, do things I'd never seen them do in years of watching the weather. No one had ever even mentioned that this was kind of an option. You'd never seen it. And every single time, 100%, it came out exactly the way I played the game. Which again was like, oh, damn. Now what? Because, I also started to realize, that people were potentially having lives changed because I was messing around. A hurricane is quite a powerful phenomena. It messes with people's lives. And I started to realize that while I was screwing around, it was screwing with people's lives. And so this made me, it made me nervous to the idea that I was doing something that was, from the perspective of all the people around me, was impossible. And I shouldn't be able to, I shouldn't believe in it so that I fit in and everything. And it shouldn't in fact be possible. There's no explanation for it. And yet, every time I played the game, every time I got into this state of mind, that whether it was a spring shower or whether it was a hurricane, it took no greater energy, it took no greater amount of focus, well, maybe a little greater amount of focus, but not a lot. It took no particularly greater effort to do massive continent size, well, partial continent size storm systems than it did to do a cloud, or whether it was overcast or sunny or whatever like that. And that just was a lot of responsibility, because I certainly didn't want to ever hurt anybody. And it was, it was a cognitive dissonance, is that the two things couldn't be true. Everything everyone taught me, everything everyone knew, everything everyone said couldn't be right, and this happened. One of them was wrong. Either I was wrong and I was mistaken and I was nuts, or they were wrong. And my tendency was to figure I must be wrong. And so I kept doing that. I did this for a long time. I didn't just do it once, and I didn't just do it twice, and I didn't just do it 3 times. I did it dozens and dozens of times until I was 100% convinced, holy crap, it's actually happening. At the same time, I felt more and more that maybe this was something I shouldn't be doing. I felt more and more that this was something that maybe I didn't have the intelligence to do, and maybe I didn't have the maturity to do, and that maybe I didn't even have the capacity to think through the repercussions of this, and so maybe I shouldn't be playing with this power. And so I was actually very reluctant to continue down that path. But the teaching spirit, things intensifying, continued to urge me on. It started to teach me how to use dreams for dream yoga, so we could use altered states and have 5-6 hours a night in interaction time and training time and discussion time and so forth, and as well as doing work during the day when I was awake and having another hour or two every day of discussion and training and so forth. And they started to teach me in dreams to do various different things, including shape shifting. And now in that case, it was more of a dream shifting or perhaps astral shifting. But they were actually even saying it's like, this is going to come in handy later on. You've got to figure out how to do this you've got to learn how to do this in your head first, and you've got to come to a place where you can imagine yourself changing. So, you got to start breaking down your attachment to your body as a human body and start being able to imagine it being able to shift into some other form, partially or entirely. And so they were encouraging me through dreams and through visualization and through shamanic journey work to start the shape-shifting process and do other things like walking on air in dreams and stuff, like in an altered state, saying, here's what we want you to do. Here's another game. Step onto the air. And it's like, okay. And they kept saying, this is going to come in handy later. There will come a day where you can do this when you're awake. We're training you while you're asleep because a day will come where you can do this while you're awake. Okay, I have often argued with the spirits. In fact, that's the more predictable response I'm going to have, is an argument than the compliance. At the same time, when they've issued me an order or when they've issued me an ultimatum, say, this is what you must do it or we're done. I've always done it. Whatever they've asked me to do, I've always done it. I may have done it grudgingly, but I've always done it. And so ultimately, while I didn't understand it, and while it was kind of freaky, and while I was nervous and scared through a lot of the stuff, I kept working. Now, eventually things started to get powerful enough, it really spooked me deeply. And about the time I graduated high school and headed off to college, I decided that maybe I needed to back off this stuff a little bit. I started to understand that my capacity to create events was outstripping my wisdom by a very large margin, and that I needed to let my maturity and wisdom catch up before I kept diddling with this stuff. Which may have been a wrong call, I don't know, but I did. I let it kind of slip. And for a long time, things started to really kind of ebb away. I was continued to be able to do basic work for a long time after that. During that period, I was able to do some spontaneous healings of other people where, I didn't even really have to touch them. I just kind of put my hand out, which isn't even really needed, but it's kind of a tactile thing. You kind of feel the energy through your hand. And I just put my hand out towards them and boom, and they'd be like, what happened? I don't hurt anymore. And so I got to do that a couple of times. I got to see how people reacted to that. I started to realize that was a whole complicated thing because you were starting to bring other minds into it, and their mind had as much or more power over their condition as mine did. I couldn't overpower them. They had the choice of what happened to them. So I realized that, and I was like, well, in this culture at this time, when people don't even really believe in this, how do I get them into the mind state where they can accept the thing that I can offer? Or could offer. And I couldn't figure it out. Most people, as with me, when you start to see this stuff actually work and you start to see that it's actually true, there's a strong cognitive dissonance. So it's all well and good to say, I'm going to heal you, all Reiki-like or something. And, not to say that Reiki doesn't work. It does. But, I'm going to do this, wave my magic hands and you're going to feel all better. And that's all fine and dandy. That's a fun game to play. And then when it works, they, lose their shit. And, people are always, it's kind of funny. It's like, can you help me? Yes, I can. Boom. And it's like, what the hell happened? What did you do? I changed it. And so I kind of backed off of that as well because the working with others dynamic was very daunting. I started to realize more and more how important it was to only work with people whose minds were ready to receive this sort of thing, which was not too many people in the West. It was decidedly few people. In this time period, somewhere, however, and this is more also very strongly bearing on this, um, I was watching, I think it was a PBS program. Frankly, I don't remember. It must have been PBS, quite frankly, but I don't remember if it was a TV program I was listening to or whether it was on the radio, PBS radio. But it was a debate, an argumentative debate that was going on. It was being sponsored by the Catholic Diocese of New York. I remember that. And it was a debate between different churches. So I don't remember who all was there, but I know the Catholic Church was there, and I know probably like the Anglican Church was there, and probably like Episcopalian and so on. It was mostly Christian. I think there may have been a representative, a rabbi, a bunch of rabbis there as well. But various different Judeo-Christian people, and they had gotten together to have this debate. If I remember right, it was at some sort of a Catholic venue, but I may be wrong about that. It was at some sort of a New York large church venue. And these guys were having this debate, and this being kind of up my alley, not Christianity being up my alley, but spirituality being up my alley. I was actually quasi interested in it, and so, I was it was on the TV, and it was playing, and I was doing other stuff. I was writing, or I was doing something else, drawing something, and I'm listening to these guys go on and debate divinity, issues of divinity. And at some point, the actual question of miracles started to come up, and the actual question about wonders and the ability to work wonders, and whether or not wonders were required as proof of faith should be required as proof of faith within Christianity. Basically, does magic have a role in the Christian experience? Is essentially, they wouldn't put it in those terms, but that's essentially the terms that it came out to. Well, this perked my ears up. It's like, oh, now you're singing my song. Okay, what do you have to say? And I can't remember. Some of the Protestants were kind of like saying, well, we do have people who have reported doing those things, and it obviously shows faith, and it obviously shows the presence of God because blah, blah, blah. And very quickly, the Catholic, and I'm pretty sure it was the Catholic bishop, just shut the whole thing down, and he came on and said that if such powers were actually from God, then surely they would be available to everyone equally. But since such powers fell into the hands of only a selected few, that they could not ever be considered as from God, but had to be the product of the devil, and therefore they should be completely avoided, nor should they be considered necessary for any level of proof or salvation or whatever. And immediately I was like, well, that's a pile of crap. And I didn't know why it was a pile of crap. And it bothered me. It was like I knew that this guy was talking out his ass. I knew that this was a political statement. I knew that something about his argument was profoundly unsound. And it would actually take me a long time to figure out exactly why it was unsound and why the guy was, in fact, talking out of his ass. But it made me curious. This was a thing that caught my attention. And so I pondered it for a good long while. Like, why is this guy... I have the conviction that this guy is wrong, but I don't understand. I mean, it was the idea that, everyone should be able to do it equally. If it was real or natural. And he was saying that such things were profoundly unnatural because not everyone could do them. And I knew that was a bullshit statement. And I was like, what is it about it? What is it? I've got to figure this out. I know it's not right. What is it about this that's a bullshit statement? And I thought about it a long time, and I couldn't really figure it out. And so, during one of my sessions, I went to The Voice, and I said, okay, I was watching this thing, and here's what they said. And I told everything I just told. And I said, and they said that this sort of stuff that we're doing is inherently unnatural. So I asked the question. I said, is this inherently unnatural? Is magic, or whatever you want to call it, miracles, wonders, whatever, thaumaturgy, is this inherently an unnatural act? And my teacher said, well, let's think about it. In her way, she'd very rarely give me the answer. She'd encourage me to go find the answer. Very different from spirit channeling. This was more like, dining with Socrates every day. Let us think about it. Let's think it through. And her response was that anything that is inherently unnatural will never occur in nature. And I was like, okay, what do you mean by that? And she expanded and she said, anything that is natural, anything that can be natural, given the proper circumstances, will appear spontaneously somewhere in nature. Whether it appears in a star, or whether it appears in, on the land, or deep under the earth, or under the ocean, or whatever, that given the right circumstances, it will happen. It will occur. It will things will combine certain ways. Things will cluster in certain ways. Things will fall apart in certain ways, given the right conditions. And that if something is profoundly unnatural, you will never see it happening of its own accord in nature. And so an example that she didn't give it at that time, but an example I would say is that, no amount of wind, rain, weather, tides, or any of these things will build a car. There's no way a car spontaneously occurs through natural forces. A car is not natural. It is an unnatural thing, or as we might call it, an artificial thing. It is a product of human art. It is an artificial thing. And so it requires, the creative genius of humanity to take natural things and put them together in a way that would never occur in order to create something that you would never see. And I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but it's unnatural or artificial. And her point was that if something does in fact happen spontaneously, given the right situation, that it cannot really be called unnatural. Good or bad, different question. You can say, well, was it a good thing or a bad thing? That's an entirely different question. But as far as natural or unnatural, that no unnatural thing happens spontaneously given the right natural situation. So I was, okay, that's interesting observation. And she said, I'll tell you what. You go look. Again, kind of her way. You go look out in the world and you tell me. You look around and you look all around. And you try to see if there are any times where the things that I'm teaching you happen to people unintentionally and entirely by accident. You go look, you see what you can find, and then you come back and you tell me what you found. And I kind of understood by that time that when these sorts of ultimatums came down, we weren't going to be talking for a while until I'd done my homework. So, okay, go forth into the world. And so where do you start to look for stuff? Well, where do you look? And so I, floundered around a while trying to figure out where to even look. And one of the things I did was I started to ask my friends. I started to ask my family. And I was instantly shocked by how many of them had stories for me. And these are the stories. I mean, it's kind of funny because unless you ask about these, you almost never hear about these. People will tell you, my great aunt Susan showed up in a dream, or I saw an apparition of my best friend who died in a car wreck, and he actually showed up right at the time of his death, or right after his death, or they'll tell you about ghost experience. They'll tell you about hauntings. Yeah, I mean, they may be somewhat reluctant, but they'll talk about it. They'll talk about aliens. They'll talk about Sasquatches. They'll talk about all this stuff. These other things, until I asked, I'd never heard about it. No one talks about it, or damn few people talk about it. So this is kind of an interesting thing. I mean, I was shocked that there's these phenomena that were occurring to people, and they simply wouldn't talk about it because they were more afraid of this than they were of talking about ghosts or spirits or many other things. And what I would start to say is like, well, you ever had this experience where this, that, or the other thing transpired? Or you ever had an experience in your life where something strange happened like this? A spontaneous weirdness. And I found that probably about somewhere between 20 and 30% of my friends, and I mean, I've never had a large circle of friends, because I'm fiercely introverted. But at the same time, I was in high school, and I probably had 20 or 30 friends, and there's other people I was acquaintances with, and I was part of different groups and so on in school, as you are. And I'd kind of bring these things up, and I would find that I thought I would have to look really hard to find one person who said, yeah, this one time, creepy, creepy. And instead, as soon as I brought it up, people were like, yeah, me too. And it started to cascade through the group. And there was suddenly this little group of people all around me, each one sharing that at some point in their life, something utterly inexplicable had happened to them. Most of them when they were much younger, somewhere between the ages of, probably like 3 and 9, which is a typical time range for unusual activity to happen anyways, but that it wasn't necessarily spirit, it was not whatever, but that while they were playing a game, almost always, while they were playing a game, something had occurred. And so, like one of my friends had said, when I was 5 years old, I used to love to jump down the stairs. We had this long stairs in the house, on the outside wall, and this long wooden banister stair going down in the house. And I used to love to run and jump off those stairs and land down on the landing. But that when I was doing this, when I was playing this game, I would jump off the top stair and I would slowly and gently float down the length of the stairs and come to land on the bottom landing. And that I did this over and over and over and over again for like a couple of months. It was, it was just something that she'd do whenever she was bored. And then one day her mother was home and she was doing it, and she said, hey mama, come look at me. Mama comes in, she jumps off the stairs, and down she goes. And she said, after that, I could never do it again. It never worked again. I tried several more times, and never worked. I always, came down hard. I've never been able to do it again. And then this gets somebody else talking, and they say, yeah, well, one time, me and my whatever, friends, cousins, brothers, uncles, whatever, we're on the park, and we're swinging on the swing. And I was swinging up real high. We're trying to see who could swing the highest, and we're all pretending we can fly and that we're flying. And at the peak of the swing, we jump off, and of course, everyone else comes down, and I continue to float out from the swing and slowly come down and actually see the tree passing me, and I'm up in the branch, just below the branches of the tree, and I finally come down softly to the ground a good 40 feet or more from the swing, way further than anyone could possibly jump. When you jump off a swing, normally you just come pretty much straight down, or you might make a little arc. Well, this person had gone far and come down gently tens of feet away. And somebody else says, yeah, me too. And it's surprising just how many of them had to do with floating or with flying, which gets back to the floating coin And gets back to the dream work that they said, one day you'll be able to figure out how to do this in your world, which no, I have not figured out how to do yet. Or I should say, I figured out how theoretically it must be done. I haven't actually tried it. And I think it would take a while to get there. But I suspect that, that's a thing. I have met over a dozen people who claim to have floated, drifted, flew short distances, nothing dramatic, not like flying all over town while they're asleep, while they were playing a game, usually as a child. Now, in the one case, it was my mother. And my mother says, oh, yeah, and that did happen to me one time. And, we had this thing where we were living, and a previous resident had built this like clubhouse for kids. There was a big shed, and it had a little clubhouse built up on top of it. It had a ladder to get up there and so forth. So it was kind of a quasi tree house without the tree. And we had a cat, and we had a fenced-in yard, and the cat would go out in the yard and stuff like that. But ever so often, she'd climb up on this, and then she'd use that to jump over the fence and go wandering around. So my mother was out working on laundry and was taking stuff off the clothesline, and the cat got up on this playhouse. So laundry in one hand, and why she didn't put the laundry down, I don't know. Assumably she didn't want it to get dirty, but who knows? Would have been wiser to put the laundry down. But holding the laundry in one hand, she climbs up the ladder and grabs the cat. So now she's on top of this rickety, because it was really soft and rickety. Somebody had made it out of particle board for an outdoor thing. So particle board would have been a bad choice for kids to play on no matter what anyways. And this was outdoors where it was getting wet and rainy. And so it was really soft and spongy. And it was really an atrocity. We hardly ever went up there or did anything because it was so damn dangerous. And so she's up there as an adult, and it's really sagging and squishing, and she's got a wriggling cat in one hand, and she's got trying to hold on to the laundry in the other hand, and the ladder, unbeknownst to her, falls away from the shed, which is, good, probably 8 to 12 feet up in the air. And she didn't know this. She's back to the ladder. She didn't know that the ladder had gone. She's trying to control the cat. She's trying to hold on to the laundry, and she starts to step down and feel for the rung of the ladder. Can't find it. Can't find it. She's, feeling around for it. Can't find it. Finally, she's said she kind of felt she got into this altered state of mind, and she felt, okay, I'm going to trust in God, and I'm just going to see what happens. And she stepped down, trying to find the rung still. She stepped down, put her weight down, and she felt her foot come in contact with something, and she put her weight down on it. And then she stepped down again, going backwards, and felt something take her weight, and she stepped down again, and continued this until she came to the ground. And when she came to the ground, she was halfway across the yard, and looking back, she could see that the ladder had completely fallen away from the thing. She had walked down on the air. Now, of course, my mother doesn't fly around the neighborhood at night that I know of, but this one time she entered this altered state, and she, from her perspective, she, it was a miraculous thing. And I was like, oh, miracles. And I got to talking about her, and she said, oh yeah, in the churches they have these things about miracles, and they talk about these things, and people do these things, and they talk about the miracles that they've experienced. And I was like, okay, well now that's something I can go do some research on. And so I started to try to find some books on miracles. And sure enough, I started to find, of course, most of the time it's like, oh, the angels came and saved me, or it was, it gets dressed up in the clothing of Christianity. But there were smatterings in through it where people who were saying about, hey, I'm not particularly religious, or I wasn't praying to God, or any of these things, but I was going and had this experience. And during this experience, something really unusual, inexplicable happened. And as I was reading through many, many, many of these case studies, people kept saying, especially the ones who were not dolling it up as a religious phenomena, but just stating what had transpired, they said, it was kind of funny. I felt weird. I felt funny. I felt that my head felt different. My thoughts cleared in a certain way, or I just felt a certain indifference or release or an open-endedness about things, and suddenly something transpired. And in among this were, again, lots of stories of people walking on air or flying for brief periods of time. There were stories about teleportation. And in one case that really impressed the hell out of me, there was a story about a man. He says it was a stranger to the town. He was going out to I think a cabin of a friend of his that was out in Colorado, and he was unfamiliar with the area and so on. And he had to go up this winding rock road from the town. The town was downhill. The cabin was uphill, and so he'd go down and get his groceries and stuff at town, and then he'd drive him back up to the cabin. And he had to go up this winding mountain road. And one time, for whatever reason, I can't remember what it was, but he ended up driving off a cliff. Something went wrong with the car or whatever. He drove off a cliff. And he says, as it was happening, shooting off all Thelma and Louise, like shooting off this cliff, he says, he felt funny. His mind kind of cleared. He knew he was about to die, but he felt no fear. And he thought, well, I'd kind of like to live if there was some way that could be arranged. And the car came down, and it came down into a lake. And that was enough to break its fall in this way that he wasn't killed. The lake was not horribly deep, so the car hit the water, but then kind of like came to rest, and it wasn't even fully submerged. It was only partially submerged. And he was able to get out of the car, and, people had seen him go over, so rescue people were coming and so forth. And okay, all well and good. Doesn't sound like a miracle until the local police and tow truck and rescue people got there, and all of them said, "This is where'd this lake come from? This lake's never been here before." That his miracle was a complete shifting of the landscape. That the maps, he says he'd gone back and looked at a map. There's no lake there. No lake on any map that he'd ever looked at. There's a lake there now. This was not done through him. It didn't like suddenly rain as he goes off the road and flood the valley. It wasn't like suddenly some cataract burst and filled the valley just in time to save his ass. There was no lake, then there was a lake. And I was like, well, that'll get your attention. So I started to understand, it's like, well, geez, there's a certain commonality here. The more of these I read, the more people talk about the mind state they found themselves in, I find that there are certain commonalities. And I recognize those commonalities as what I am being taught to do. That there's a close similarity. And so then I started to say, well, now there's some new aspects here I hadn't really taken into account before. Let's see what happens if I start to include these with it. And lo and behold, everything got better and easier. And so, of course, that answered my question. It was that the bishop was very, very wrong. Now, of course, I spent the time talking about Pareto distributions last time, and I've spent time talking about who experiences spirituality. And those numbers I gave you, those are Pareto distribution numbers. And it says that basically spirituality is a perfectly natural human endeavor. It has the same numbers, same ratios, same presentation as every other human activity that you can engage in, which argues very strongly that is a perfectly natural human activity. Just because 80% of the activity happens to 20% of the people, that does not, and that also takes the skeptics, the materialistic skeptics who say, well, it's only 20% of the people and they're just nuts. Well, everything only happens to 20% of the people. It's just a different 20% each time. 20% is normal. That is a normal statistical number, that 80% of anything happens to 20% of the population. That's not proof that it's not real. That's proof that it's perfectly natural. That aside, answering my question, is this natural or unnatural? It is perfectly natural. And it happens by accident. And it has a lot to do with a particular altered state of consciousness. And it has a lot to do with playing games. And of course, it was the spirits were giving me games to play. And visualizations. Let's pretend, let's imagine, let's visualize. And if you did it in this way, with this mindset, what you played became your reality. Now, took a lot of other years, and I had to run into a lot of other, elders. I had to start talking to traditional elders and Native Americans and people who tried to continue to live according to their ancestors as closely as they could. And of course, most of them continue to keep things largely secret. But you started to read more between the lines that, yeah, they knew this too. Now, okay, this has gone on pretty long, and I'm going to kind of bring this to the conclusion, but I think one of the ultimate ones was discovering the presence of the inner Hyoka red elk and his presentations on Coast to Coast AM radio back in the late 90s, where he had had a great vision of some calamity forthcoming. And in response to his conviction that there was a calamity coming, he started to teach other spiritual skills. He started to teach telepathy. He did a whole audio recording series on telepathy, which I hope to review at some time in the future. And I reviewed it, and lo and behold, what he was teaching was exactly what my spirits had taught me. And he talked about he did a whole series on how to learn how to fly. And he talked about how it was a game, and how you had to have fun, and it had to come from a place of joy, and that what you needed to do was get on a bed or an old couch or get on a trampoline or something and start jumping up and down and pretending you could fly. And that once you got into the right state of mind, the right altered state of mind, you'd find that one time you go up and you just hesitate there for half a second, much like my dime when I was 9 years old. Much like my friends who jumped down the stairs and floated, or jumped off the swing and floated. And he says, and this was a way to train to get into this altered state. That as long as you stayed in the altered state, you stayed in the air. The moment you slipped out of the right state, you fell back down, which is why you wanted to be over something fairly soft. Because you would, this was, he clearly said, and I would reiterate, don't jump off a building. That's dumb. You're almost certainly going to fall and hurt yourself. But as you're playing a game, swinging on a swing, jumping on a trampoline, and so on, and if you really get into this game, if you really commit to the game, you'll find that once you get into the right state of mind, the moment you get into the right state of mind, you pause. And you actually stand on the air. The moment you go, oh my goodness, down you go. And so the trick is to get so able to hold that state of mind that you can just stay there, and then there's other things you can do from there if you ever get good enough. And he said, well, for him, he'd only ever managed to get like half a second or something like that. He had been able to pause briefly in the air, that he'd never been able to stay up there, that there's at least one woman he was teaching who was able to stay up there for 20-30 seconds at a time before she'd fall back down. There is a rather large gap between doing this accidentally, which people seem to do really dramatic things accidentally, and they seem to do very small things intentionally. It's much harder to do it intentionally. But these things occur. And the thing is that it started to occur is like you can do the things that they tell you cannot do. You can shift landscapes. You can transmute matter from one form to another. You can change your body from an unhealthy form to a healthy form. You can shift your shape between what it is now and whatever it is that you want to play the game that it should become. And I've talked to many people and they've said, yes, this is knowledge amongst our people. We don't talk about it with outsiders. And they dropped some hints. They gave you the whole, if you're smart and you know what we're saying, you can read between the lines. And so they dropped some hints and they dropped some information. It's not like I haven't picked up some information. None of them, but all of them were under oath, and they wouldn't break their oaths. So they'd, drop a few crumbs. I mean, it's one of those things where people who do this, they'd love to talk about it, but you don't talk about it. It's one of the most exciting things you can come across. It's one of the coolest damn things that exists. You want to talk about it, but of course for most of those people, they're under an oath of secrecy, so they can't talk about it. And so they find out that, some random whitey like me somehow miraculously knows about this stuff, and they can't figure out how that happened. And they're like, oh, you know about it too? Isn't it cool? Have you ever done it like this? But they can't do that, so they're like, well, it's kind of a thing, and well, we can't talk about it, you know. And you know, I get it, I get it. But like I said, since I've never been part of those cultures, well, I've been, you know, unceremoniously turned aside for perfectly legitimate reasons I understand, even though it's still kind of like, God damn it. Um, at the same time, it's like, you know, it's been enough. And I have talked to people from other places in Asia and stuff, and they, yeah, we do it too. And that's how we have a special way. We have our own special game. We have our own special song. We have our own special ceremony or approach. But yeah, that's a thing, and we do it too. And that's how we do it. So I'm going to call it good there. That is kind of, I mean, there's a lot more things I could bring up. Those are some of the highlights of how I kind of figured it out. It did take me a long time to figure out that animal transformation was the same thing. But I have gotten that confirmed by lineage shamans from traditional countries, have agreed that yes, that is in fact the exact same thing, that animal transformation is within the cadre, is within that cluster of phenomena that has to do with this altered state, and it is through this effort, the same kind of effort, that one accesses that transformation. They weren't really willing to go much further than that, other than to say, you're not wrong. You know, it's more or less I making a statement and they say, you know, I can't say. You know, they'll say, no, that if I'm wrong, they say, no, you're wrong. If I'm not wrong, they'll say, I can't say. Or they'll say, well, you know, you're not wrong. You know. And so, you know, it's one of those things, it's like playing 20 questions. But, you know, I've been able to pick up a fair amount of information that way. But I have had blatant confirmation. Yeah, the animal transformations that other cultures endure or seek or achieve is achieved through this same art. So next time, I think I'll talk a little bit more probably about red elk, or well, I don't know if I'm going to talk about red elk. Maybe I'll talk about some of all the things that you can do, because it isn't just animal transformations. It is a whole. I mean, it is kind of the shaman's art. It's the shaman's magic, though it'd be more appropriate to call it thaumaturgy, because magic is working with spirits. Obviously, I worked with spirits to learn this, so in my work with spirits, that was magic. But thaumaturgy, the word thaumaturgy means the intentional creation of wonders or miracles, and so really shapeshifting could also be called thaumaturgy. But that's an unfamiliar word, so we'll use shapeshifting. You can also call it the art of transformation, and it's been called a lot of things by a lot of people. You know, by no means, the West has bumped into this time and time again. They've just never taken it to that level. You know, the average person, I mean, they get hung up on the whole biblical passage that it takes two or more people, or it takes a group of people, or, you know, if we could get together a million minds, that it's mind power. Again, they're stuck in the mental way of looking at things, so they think it's mind power, and they're stuck in this sort of materialistic idea that there's objects and energy has to be exerted on these objects. And so Westerners usually feel like you've got to build up all this energy so you have a massive amount of energy to fling at something and so on. And that is completely the wrong way to look at it. Because quite frankly, there's no difference, like I said, is working with these things. There's no difference between doing the tiniest thing and the biggest thing. The only difference between the two is the amount of focus that you need to execute it. The bigger the thing is, the more you have to be focused. You have to be precise and clearly focused in that state of mind. But that's the difference. There's no physical strain. There's no more energy. There's no building up of energy. There's no anything. It is the same to do something continent-sized as it is to do something in a 3 mile radius of yourself, like messing with weather or whatever, or messing immediately with something immediately in front of you, or you walking on the air. There's no difference between that and completely changing things on a massive scale. No difference, except for focus. So, that's another thing. I want to start breaking down exactly. Like I said, I did a lot of research into these accidental, miraculous events that are associated with shapeshifting, and I found certain patterns, and I was able to define those patterns about how you get into that mind state and exactly what that mind state seems to entail. I have since found written in literature confirmation of all of that within like ancient Chinese writing and writing from Asia, from Tibet and Nepal and India and places like that. That yes, this is how at least anciently there were Chinese who saw it this way. I hesitate to say the Chinese see it that way because they certainly don't see that way modernly. But anciently, some Chinese knew this, and they said it exactly. They basically laid it out verbatim. So, and, some of them were talking about Tai Chi and other things like that, but the same pattern occurs again and again. Interestingly, the deeper you go into this, the more complicated it becomes. The whole idea of playing games, that's how you get in. Once you're in there, there's a whole world to explore, and the deeper you dive, the more it becomes a different practice, a practice that the natives called hollow bone technique. This is referred to occasionally as hollow bone technique. And when you get to that level, you start to see geometries. You start to get all kinds of levels of information. And it's interesting that when you study the geometry, what you get is the I Ching from China. You get the Bagua and you get the I Ching. So it's basically, again, showing that the ancient Taoist philosophers were completely conversant with this skill and that altered state of mind, because this is the pattern of that altered state of mind. You don't see that initially. Initially, you're playing games. Eventually, you find this pattern, because I found the pattern and I started trying to work and define the pattern. And then, of course, it was suggested that I might try to look towards China by the teaching voices. And of course, I found the I Ching. And when I read the I Ching, I was like, holy crap. This is what I saw. This is exactly what I saw. I was trying to figure out how to even write it down. I mean, it's a very elegant way. The trigrams and hexagrams are a very elegant way of writing it down. I was trying to figure out how to even write it down, and what I was coming up with, it was by no means nearly as elegant as what the ancient Chinese came up with, but it was the exact same pattern. And then I find that pattern occurs in Egypt, and it occurs in Neoplatonic and Platonic concepts and Pythagorean concepts and many other places. And so this is something that's been bumped into, at least peripherally, if not blatantly, by people through all of time and every culture. Like I said, it's inherently human. About 20% of any population is going to accidentally bump into this during their lifespans. It may be as high as 30%, but it's at least 20%. So it's been seen a lot. A lot of people have found it. It actually is kind of amazing of how hard the West has to work to remain ignorant of this, because it's kind of a self-evident thing. Everyone else knows about it. And me talking about these things is going to sound incredible. Again, to people in other cultures, this sounds perfectly normal, and they'll be like, oh yeah, that thing. Yeah, that's my cousin Lenny. Lenny's just the exact same thing, except for he's worse. And that's their take on it. It's perfectly natural and normal. They understand that. When I talk about these things to Native American people, when I've talked about this to a Lakota man in the Hyoka Lodge, or when I talk to this about, from other elders in the Delaware and so on, and they're like, oh yeah, we know what that. Yeah, I got a cousin like that. Yeah, she's crazy, but she's cool and she can really pull stuff off. I bet she'd never done this. She does that all the time. So for them, whether they be from India or Nepal or Tibet or whatever, they're like, oh yeah, you poor bastard. In our culture, nothing. Crickets. Crickets if you're lucky. So yes, this is a thing, and it's a natural thing. And there's the way, there's a good chance that if you're listening to this, there's a good chance, 1 in 5 chance, you've already done it. You've already been there. And quite frankly, like I said, when I've taught people the games and encouraged them to play the games, I've never seen anyone fail. Now, there has been at least one time where I did fail. And actually, that was the shocker. There was one time I was trying to get it to rain, and it didn't. And I have found people reference that does happen from time to time. No one actually knows why. Usually it's, the only statement I found about it is it's the will of heaven, which isn't really helpful. But it does suggest that, yeah, there are some times where for whatever reason, out of the blue, it doesn't work. But frankly, if you do it, even kind of, as long as you're in that right mind state, it works, 99.99% of the time. It's actually a shock when it doesn't work. So it is natural and it is inherently human. It is something we can do. And but in this culture, it is, like I say, people are amazed that they find somebody who can talk about this stuff. It's like, well, actually, there's all kinds of people who know about this stuff. Is again, they just won't talk because of the code of silence. And quite frankly, I'd be reluctant to talk too if I hadn't been blatantly told talk about it. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that wasn't too masturbatory on my part. It wasn't really about me. It was about the discovery. It was the path of discovery, and what I discovered and how I discovered it. And I hope that I know there's a lot of you who have also had a hard road, and many of you had a harder road than I've had. And somebody who has the guts to say it, I've always found, is the first step towards healing. And so it's useful to have the guts to come out and say it. It is a service to be willing to speak. Because, like I said, this is the untalked about thing. I was shocked at just how many people have had this experience and know something about it, and they tell nobody. They never tell anybody ever. For the same fears, I probably came a lot closer to actually being done away with than they ever did, but they understood that it's the risk and you don't talk about it. People tell you it's, you're hallucinating, you're daydreaming, you're a fool, you're crazy, you're whatever, and they really gaslight the hell out of you. Well, yeah, you got to be careful of that. I mean, there are people who, there are conditions that mimic some of this stuff. There are mental conditions. I have run into people with mental conditions that there's no spirit around, and they're not describing anything that I'm talking about. They are, in a unrecognized altered reality that is oftentimes highly dangerous. There is such a thing as some of these conditions, these mental illness conditions. So that is a problem, and you always have to, it is good practice to always consider, where do I stand in this situation? Am I nuts? But the fact of the matter is that no, there's far fewer people who are nuts than get called nuts. And there's lots of people that have had these same experiences or have relatives who've had the same experiences, and people don't talk because they're afraid they're going to be called nuts until some, dumbass like myself stands up and says, well, then I'm going to go and blurt this out, despite the fact that I acknowledge that it's dangerous. I'm going to go ahead and blurt it out. And then they say, thank goodness. I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was going crazy. Everyone always told me I was going crazy. Well, check. But generally speaking, nah. Probably not. It's you always have to be skeptical and you always have to be self-examining, but, not these things. These things are common. Read about people who are, read books about what it means to be nuts, or whatever variety of nuts you're feared of, and you can quickly find out whether that meets your situation or not. This shape-shifting stuff, that's not described. This is not something that's come up much in any psychiatric literature that I've read about. It would just be dismissed as some form of delusion. Possibly schizophrenia, but probably just some form of delusion. But no, there's millions and millions of people who understand it's not a delusion. It's only the Western academic morons that make that mistake. So, yeah, I'll be back. We'll talk about some more shape-shifting stuff shortly, and we'll see where it goes from there.